I had been working at this company for 3 years. In the beginning, I thought the job was pretty decent, pay wasn't bad, benefits were okay, and the office vibe was manageable. But there was one glaring problem: my boss, Jim. He wasn't just your regular boss who occasionally gets on your nerves. Jim was the type of boss who could ruin your entire day before you even stepped into the office. The man was an absolute nightmare. At first, I tried to deal with it, thinking that maybe I was overreacting. But the more time I spent working under Jim, the more I realized it wasn't just me. Everyone on my team had similar complaints. He micromanaged everything, always questioned every little detail, and constantly breathed down our necks like we were a bunch of kids who couldn't do our jobs. But the worst part? Jim took credit for our work. It wasn't subtle either. He would openly present our ideas and projects as his own during meetings with higher-ups. Whenever we finished something big, you could bet Jim would swoop in, slap his name on it, and act like he had done everything himself. No thanks, no recognition for the people who actually put in the hours, just Jim basking in the glory. It was frustrating, but what could we do? He had this hold over the company's leadership, so no one dared to confront him. I tried to keep my head down, figuring if I just did my job and avoided drama, I'd be fine. But boy, was I wrong. Things had been bad for a while, but I was able to push through, telling myself that eventually, someone would recognize Jim for the fraud he was. But one day, he crossed a line that I couldn't ignore. I had been working on a massive project for weeks. It was something that could really make a difference for the company, and I'd poured everything into it, late nights, working weekends, the whole deal. I wanted it to be perfect. Finally, after what felt like forever, I finished the project. I was proud of what I had done and couldn't wait to present it. But before I could even schedule a meeting to show it to the higher-ups, Jim swooped in. He sent out an email to the executive team with my project attached and claimed it as his own. I didn't even get a mention. No, thanks to my team, or shout out to the people who made this happen, nothing. Just Jim, soaking up the praise like he had been the one grinding for weeks on end. I couldn't believe it. All that work, all that time, and it was stolen from me in a single email. I felt my blood boiling. This wasn't the first time Jim had pulled something like this, but it was definitely the worst. I tried to keep my cool, but it felt like a slap in the face. The guy hadn't lifted a finger on this project, and yet here he was, taking all the credit. That's when I knew things had to change. I couldn't sit back and let this go. I couldn't keep letting Jim walk all over me and the rest of the team. He had to pay for what he did. I didn't know how I was going to do it yet, but I knew I couldn't just let it slide this time. Jim had crossed the line, and it was time for me to figure out how to get back at him. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, they did. A few days after Jim stole my project, I got a message from him: come to my office. I didn't think much of it at the time, figuring he just wanted to go over something trivial. I walked in, sat down, and Jim didn't waste any time. "We have to let you go," he said, barely hiding the smirk on his face. I blinked, confused. "Wait, what? Why?" I asked. No warning, no reason, just like that, I was out. Jim leaned back in his chair, shrugging as if it wasn't a big deal. "It's just not working out," he said, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. I could feel the anger bubbling inside me, but I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing me crack. I tried to keep it together, but I was stunned. How could this be happening? Jim didn't even try to explain himself further. He just handed me a termination letter, already prepared, and pointed toward the door. No performance issues, no complaints, no valid reason whatsoever, just fired, out of the blue. It was like a bad dream. This guy had stolen my project, then fired me with no explanation, all while wearing that stupid smug look on his face. I couldn't believe it. I had put in 3 years at this company, worked my butt off, and this was how it ended. With Jim, of all people, pulling the strings. I felt completely blindsided, like I'd been hit by a truck. One moment, I was doing my job, and the next, my entire life had flipped upside down. I grabbed my stuff, numb, and walked out of the office for the last time. As I left, I could feel the eyes of my coworkers on me, but no one said a word. They all knew how Jim operated, but they were too scared to speak up. I didn't blame them, I had been in the same boat. But as I drove home that day, the numbness started to fade, and something else took over. I wasn't just sad, I was furious. Jim had fired me for no reason, stolen my work, and thought he'd get away with it. Well, he had another thing coming. Driving home that day, I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my head. Fired. For no reason. It felt so surreal, like I had just been robbed, and in a way, I had. 3 years of hard work flushed down the drain because of Jim's ego. The worst part was, I had bills to pay, rent, car payments, student loans. It wasn't like I had a fat savings account to fall back on. I couldn't afford to be out of work for long. When I got home, I just sat there, staring at the wall. The anger I had felt driving back had shifted into a hollow pit of frustration and fear. What was I supposed to do now? No job, no income, and thanks to Jim, no solid reference either. I couldn't exactly use him as a recommendation after being fired. The realization that Jim could screw up my future job prospects hit me like a ton of bricks. He didn't just fire me, he put my entire career at risk. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept thinking about Jim, about how smug he looked, about how he had stolen my work and now left me jobless. It was infuriating. How could someone be so heartless and get away with it? I kept running scenarios in my head, imagining how I could get back at him, how I could make him feel the same pain he had caused me. But at the same time, I felt helpless. I had no power in this situation. He was still sitting in his cushy office, probably patting himself on the back for handling me, while I was left scrambling to figure out my next move. But then, in the early hours of the morning, something clicked. My frustration turned into determination. Jim may have won the battle, but I wasn't about to let him win the war. There had to be something I could do, some way to expose him for the fraud he was. I just needed to find it. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. If Jim had fired me for no reason, maybe there was something shady going on behind the scenes, something that he didn't want anyone to know about. And if I could find it, I could use it to take him down. As I lay there that night, thoughts racing, I suddenly remembered something Jim had let slip during a company event months earlier. We were at one of those forced happy hours, everyone pretending to enjoy themselves while secretly wishing they were at home. Jim had gotten a little too comfortable after a few drinks, bragging about his side business. He mentioned how he was doing some consulting on the side for extra cash. I didn't think much of it at the time. But now, as I reflected on everything, it hit me like a lightning bolt. Jim was using company resources for his side gig. I didn't catch it back then, but now, with my job gone and nothing to lose, I saw it clearly. Jim was always on his phone during work hours, using the company computer to send personal emails and make phone calls that had nothing to do with our projects. I realized he had been running his little side hustle on company time. That was a huge no-no according to company policy. I sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. If what I remembered was true, I had just found my way to get back at him. Jim wasn't just stealing credit for our work, he was flat out breaking company rules. Using company resources for personal gain was a serious offense, one that could get someone fired on the spot if it was proven. The wheels in my head started turning. If I could find proof of this, Jim wouldn't just lose his job, he'd be blacklisted in the industry. And the best part? He had no idea that I knew about his side business. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how deep Jim's arrogance ran. He probably thought he was untouchable, that no one would ever figure out what he was doing. But I had a front row seat to his bad behavior, and now I was determined to make him pay for everything he'd done, not just to me, but to everyone else he'd walked over. I finally had a plan. With my mind set on taking Jim down, I knew the first step was gathering evidence. If I was going to do this right, I couldn't just rely on vague memories or rumors. I needed hard proof. Luckily, I had been around long enough to know where Jim kept his files and how careless he could be with company resources. The guy practically left a trail of breadcrumbs leading right to his shady dealings. I started by digging through my old work emails, looking for anything that might connect Jim to his side business. I remembered that he had asked me to send him a few documents in the past, and as I scrolled through my inbox, there it was, a request for a detailed report on one of our clients, except he had forwarded it to his personal email address. Strange. I did some more digging and found several other instances where he'd done the same thing, sending confidential company documents to his personal email account. It didn't take a genius to figure out that he was probably using these to help his side hustle. Next, I checked some of the company's shared files. Jim wasn't exactly tech-savvy, and he hadn't bothered to clean up after himself. There were several documents in the shared drive with his name on them, financial reports, client contact lists, and even a few internal strategy documents, that had no reason to be there. It was clear that he had been using our company's resources for his personal gain. The more I found, the more confident I became. This wasn't just a one-time slip-up. Jim had been doing this for months, maybe even longer. And I had the receipts to prove it. All those times he had acted like he was untouchable. Well, now I was holding the evidence that could destroy him. I compiled everything, emails, documents, and screenshots. My folder of dirt on Jim was growing by the minute, and it was only a matter of time before I would have enough to bring him down for good. I just needed to figure out the best way to drop the bomb without it blowing back on me. With all the evidence I had gathered, I was ready to make my move. But I knew one thing for sure, I couldn't let Jim know that I was the one behind it. If I made the mistake of letting him trace this back to me, he'd find a way to make my life miserable, again. No, I needed to cover my tracks perfectly. So, I decided to send everything anonymously. I carefully packaged up the documents, emails, and screenshots into a zip file and wrote a detailed letter outlining Jim's misconduct. I made sure to include all the important details, like how Jim was using company time and resources for his side business, and how he had been violating company policy for months. I even included some of his personal emails that were sent during working hours, making sure to highlight the most incriminating ones. There was no way they could ignore it. The next step was to send it off. I didn't use my work email, obviously. I created a temporary, throwaway email account and sent the entire package to HR and the company's legal team. I didn't use any identifying information, just the facts, hoping that the weight of the evidence would be enough to take Jim down. I felt a rush of excitement as I clicked send. It was out of my hands now. But I couldn't just sit and wait. I knew that if Jim found out, he'd do whatever he could to cover his tracks. I needed to make sure the damage was done before he had a chance to retaliate. So, I kept a close eye on the office news, watching for any sign of what was happening behind the scenes. I felt like I was in a silent battle with Jim, one that I was finally ready to win. For the next few days, I didn't hear anything. But I could feel something brewing. I knew HR had to be investigating, and when they started digging into Jim's activities, he was going to panic. I was just waiting for the inevitable chaos to unfold. 2 weeks after I sent the email, I was still anxiously waiting, unsure of what was happening at the office. I didn't know exactly when Jim would face the consequences, but I knew it was only a matter of time. And then, one afternoon, I got a message from my old coworker, Sarah. She was still at the office and had always been one of the few people who wasn't scared of Jim. "Hey, you're not gonna believe this," she texted. "They called Jim into a meeting this morning with HR. He looked so freaked out. I think he's in serious trouble." My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't help but grin. I had done it. The evidence I sent had reached HR, and Jim was finally being held accountable. Sarah's message continued, they've been investigating him for weeks now. They found out about all the shady stuff he's been doing on company time, using company resources for his side business. Everyone's talking about it, and it's all about to hit the fan. I could hardly contain my excitement. It felt like a weight had been lifted off my chest. The man who had tormented me for months, who had stolen my work, lied, and micromanaged every aspect of my life, was finally going to face the consequences. And I wasn't the only one who knew it now. Word was getting around, and people in the office were starting to put the pieces together. Sarah went on, they're not saying much, but people are guessing he's gonna be fired. It's all over the place, HR's talking about integrity violations. I don't know how he's gonna wiggle out of this one. I couldn't stop smiling. Jim had thought he was untouchable. Now, the walls were closing in, and there was nothing he could do to escape it. I knew it was only a matter of time before he would be out of there. And once he was gone, the office would be a much better place. A few days after Sarah's text, the inevitable happened. Jim was gone. Just like that. I woke up one morning to a company-wide email from HR. The subject line read, Important Company Update. It was brief, but the words jumped out at me. After a thorough investigation, Jim Harris has been terminated due to violations of company policy related to integrity and the use of company resources. It was like music to my ears. I remember staring at that email in disbelief, a grin spreading across my face. Jim was finally gone, and I hadn't even had to lift a finger. The email didn't go into the specifics of his actions, but everyone in the office knew what had happened. The gossip had already spread like wildfire, and people were openly celebrating his departure. The whole office seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Everyone had known Jim was a problem, but they were too afraid to speak up. Now, with him out of the picture, the atmosphere felt lighter. People were joking around in the break room again, and even the management team seemed a little more approachable. It was amazing how much the vibe changed in just a few days. I got a few texts from my former coworkers who were just as relieved as I was. It's about time, one of them wrote. Can't believe it took this long to get rid of him. Another said, the office has already improved without him. You wouldn't believe the difference. It felt good knowing that Jim's toxic behavior had affected not just me, but everyone in the office. His downfall wasn't just a victory for me, it was a win for the whole team. But what really made my day was hearing that Jim's firing wasn't as smooth as he'd hoped. I got a message from Sarah later that week. He looked like a ghost when he was called into HR, she told me. I think he really thought he was untouchable. Turns out, he had tried to argue his way out of it, but once the company saw all the evidence against him, there was no way he could talk his way back in. As the weeks went by, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction watching how Jim's life was unraveling. Word had spread fast about his firing, and it didn't take long for people to figure out why he had been let go. The more I heard, the better it felt knowing I played a part in it. Turns out, Jim had a reputation for being difficult to work with long before I ever stepped into that office. Former colleagues started speaking up about his shady behavior, how he would throw others under the bus to cover his mistakes, how he'd use company time for personal calls, and how he'd act like he was above the rules. What shocked me most, though, was that no one seemed to want to hire him afterward. I had a mutual friend who worked at another company in the same industry, and I casually asked about Jim. I wouldn't touch him with a 10-foot pole, my friend said. We've heard all about what happened. No one wants to deal with a guy like that. It wasn't just the company that had blacklisted him, it seemed like his entire professional network had turned its back on him. After everything I'd seen, I wasn't surprised. The real kicker came a few weeks later when I heard through the grapevine that Jim had been struggling to find work. One of my old co-workers, who had connections in the same field, mentioned that Jim had applied for a position at a rival company. They took one look at his references and told him they had already made a decision, she said. He was rejected. I couldn't stop laughing when I heard that. Jim, the guy who had thought he was untouchable, couldn't even get a job interview. His reputation had completely crumbled, and he had no one to blame but himself. It was the perfect kind of karma. He had played dirty, and now the consequences were catching up to him in ways he hadn't imagined. A few months after Jim's downfall, I got an email that made me stop in my tracks. It was a job offer from a competitor in the same industry, the very company Jim had been trying to land a position at before he was fired. I couldn't believe it at first. I thought I was imagining things, but it was real. The email was from a recruiter who had seen my resume online and was impressed by my experience. They wanted to schedule an interview. I couldn't help but smile. I'd been trying to get back into the field for a while, but no one had given me a shot. Now, here was a company that was actively seeking me out. And the kicker. Jim had tried to land this exact job but had been rejected. I remember thinking how sweet the irony was. Jim had taken credit for my hard work, tried to throw me under the bus, and made my life miserable. But now, I was getting an opportunity to step into a position he had desperately wanted, and failed to get. It felt like the universe had a sense of humor. I scheduled the interview for the following week, but before I even got to that, I got a call from Sarah. She had heard the news too. "You're gonna love this," she said. "Jim's so bitter right now. He tried to apply at the same company you're interviewing with. They rejected him again." The position was everything I had hoped for, a supportive work environment, new challenges, and most importantly, a boss who appreciated my contributions. But the best part? It was the exact same company Jim had desperately wanted to work for. The one he had been rejected from, not once, but twice. It was almost poetic. I couldn't help but think about how Jim had tried to sabotage my career, how he'd made me feel small and insignificant. Now, here I was, thriving, while he was stuck in a downward spiral. I heard from a former coworker a few months after I'd settled into my new role. "You won't believe what happened to Jim," she said. "He's working at a dead-end job now, totally unrelated to the industry. Word is, he couldn't find anything in his field after his reputation took a hit." By this point, I had truly let go of all the anger I'd once held toward Jim. I was far beyond seeking revenge, it had already played out in the most satisfying way possible.